Hey, friend, welcome back to the Lifestyle School podcast. I'm really glad that you're here today because we're going to have a conversation that cuts through so much of the confusion, the noise, and honestly, I think the arguing that surrounds food. And, we live at a time where every diet claims to be the answer, right? From carnivore saying that meat is the only natural food to the vegans saying that plants are the purest form of nourishment. People who are on the paleo diet say we need to eat like they did in the Stone Age. Keto says carbs are the absolute devil. And then, the Mediterranean diet saying health comes from things like olive oil and wine. And so, each group will say, this is how humans are meant to eat, and this is what our ancestors did, right? And in some ways, they're all correct. But when we actually look at human history, not the memes, not the marketing, not the 6-second TikTok version, we see something very different. Okay. There has never been one perfect diet. There's only ever been human diets, right? Shaped by geography. There's been different climates, seasons, cultures, and the simple question of what foods were available here and how did people make it nourishing enough to survive and thrive. And what we're going to find today is that humans have always eaten some combination of protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And the real shift wasn't the macronutrients, it truly was the processing of these foods. So today we're going to talk through what real people in real cultures actually ate before processed foods entered the world and how their food systems supported health for thousands of years without obesity being a widespread issue. And then we're going to talk about what changed quickly and dramatically once industrialized food entered the picture. And hopefully by the end, I think you'll have more clarity, more peace, and more freedom to nourish your body in a grounded, thoughtful, and hopefully confident way. But as always, before we get into it, guys, I got to give you my disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only. I am not a medical doctor, and this is not medical advice. If you have any major health concerns, please talk with your qualified healthcare practitioner before making any major changes to your diet or lifestyle for your own safety, right? So, with that, guys, let's get into it. So, I think where to really start is humans are incredibly adaptable eaters. We have lived in icy tundras, in tropical rainforests, in the desert, in high mountain valleys, in fertile river basins. And in each of those places, humans learned how to feed themselves with what the land offered. And that means that the diet of the Inuit in the Arctic looked nothing like the diet of someone in rural Vietnam. And the diet of ancient India looked nothing like the diet of Greece, right? And the diet of West Africa looked nothing like the diet of northern China. But all of them supported health and all of them supported strong bones, strong teeth, fertility, endurance, and longevity. And all of them included protein, fat, and carbohydrates, just in different proportions. So, I think rather than asking what diet is correct, a much more helpful question is how close is my food to the way humans have historically interacted with food? And that is physically, culturally, and relationally. And to answer that, we need to go back and actually look at what people ate. So, to go back to the Mediterranean, let's start there. Imagine a small village, overlooking a terraced hillside. Meals were simple, they were repetitive, and they were deeply connected to their local land. They were having olive oil pressed from local olives, bread made from wheat that grew more slowly, that had less gluten in it, and that was milled in stones instead of industrial steel rollers. They had beans and lentils simmered for hours. Fish was caught that morning. They had goat cheese that they made right there, tomatoes, herbs, wine, but the wine was never to escape life, right? It was to accompany it. And, to be clear, this diet was high in carbohydrates. It was moderate in fat typically and had a modest amount of protein, and obesity was rare. And, it was not because carbs are magical or, olive oil cures everything, but because the food was whole it was slow, and it was connected to labor. People walked, they cooked, they shared meals. They likely didn't snack all day. The food had what you could call edges. It had fiber, it had texture, it had time, and it had meaning. And in Vietnam, here meals revolved around rice, broth, herbs, and small amounts of pork, fish, or egg. There was lots of plants, there was lots of flavor, lots of variety, but again, very simple ingredients. This was a higher carb diet, but it worked because the carbohydrates were eaten with broth, with protein, and with vegetables. And I can guarantee you they weren't sitting in front of a TV consuming food really quickly or in the car on the way to a sporting event, right, for their kids. They were sitting down and they were chewing their food. Their meals were eaten slowly in community and not out of packages. And in Vietnam, obesity was rare until about the 1990s when processed snacks, things like soda and cheap seed oils, began to become widely available. And again, I think this kind of goes back to reiterate that it wasn't necessarily a carb problem, it was a processing problem. But we will get into talking a little bit more about carbs when we're done looking at some of these different geographical areas. So just hold tight if you're like, Hope, what you're saying, I feel like is contradictory to everything you've said in the past. But I found researching for this podcast very interesting. So in China, northern and southern China both had strong food cultures that were rooted in balance. Okay, so rice or millet were a foundational staple to their diet. They had vegetables daily. Meat was used in small amounts for flavor, but not necessarily volume. And bone broth was not a trend there. It was daily life. A lot of broth-based meals similar to Vietnam. And so for thousands of years, this supported stable body weight, athletic performance, fertility, and long life. And what we see is obesity rose sharply again in the 1900s. Or I should actually say in the 20th century, um, when bottled vegetable oil became available for frying, when sugary packaged snacks became available, things like instant noodles started to become more popular, and sugary beverages were introduced. And you know, it wasn't the necessarily the rice that they were eating or the fact that they were doing a lot of stir fries or that they ate soy. It really came back to the processing of the food. And if we move over to India, in India, meals were traditionally included rice or flatbread, lentils, beans, yogurt, ghee, spices that supported digestion, and fermented foods. Again, it was another culture that had a high carb diet, moderate in fat and moderate in protein. And obesity rose not when rice was eaten in this geographical area, not when lentils were be a big thing, not when ghee was used, but obesity rose when ghee started to be replaced with industrial seed oils, and when packaged sweets and snacks became cheap and something that was constantly available. And then I want to move all the way over to the Arctic. Here, the land produces almost no plants, right? So a very different region. The Inuits thrived on diets of seal, of fish, whale, organ meats, and fat. And so what's really interesting about the Inuit people is that they ate a very high fat diet, a very high protein diet, and almost no carbohydrates because there just wasn't much available. I do believe they ate some seaweed, and they were lean, they were strong, they were capable of extraordinary endurance. And in this culture, again, obesity only appeared when white flour, sugar, and processed packaged foods started to become an imported piece of their food system, just like every other place that we've looked at. And so again, I want to say it wasn't, the fat that they were eating. It wasn't the protein. It wasn't the carbs. It was really a real food versus a processed food issue. And so I do, though, want to talk. I think this is really important specifically about grains because this is one of the most, I think, misunderstood areas in the modern nutrition conversation. When we think about, you know, historically, people have eaten a lot of grains, a lot of cultures who have not historically dealt with obesity until recent times. And the grains eaten historically were not what we eat today, is essentially what it comes down to. So, wheat used to be short growing. It used to be lower in gluten, higher in minerals, lower in yield. It would be stone ground and it would be eaten with fats and proteins, and it would be fermented or soaked before baking, which really changes the makeup of how your body ends up using uh, those grains, right? It changes how the digestion process works if it's fermented or soaked before baking. And today's wheat, though, is bred to be very high yield, and it's bred for softness and shelf stability. It contains more gluten, especially the appetite stimulating protein called gliadin, and it's grown in mineral depleted soils, and it's ground so finely it behaves like sugar in our bloodstream. And the problem isn't wheat existing, because wheat has been around forever. The problem is how wheat has changed and how we now consume it. We eat it fast, often, and alone, where historically that just hasn't been the case. And rice has changed as well. It's changed less than the wheat that we consume, but how we pair rice has changed completely. So traditional rice was eaten with bitter greens, with fish broth, with protein, fermented sauces, slow meals, more chewing. And then, meals used to be eaten within community and much more than we do today. But now rice is eaten with sugary sauces, fried seed oils. We have very large portions. We eat super fast and we eat very distracted. And so, the grain itself has changed as well. They historically ate, more of like the whole kernel. The white rice that we eat today is not the same rice that they were eating historically. But it's not just the rice, it's also the way that we pair it and eat it. It's the context of which we eat it, which is both like how we pair it with foods and also, the pace of life that we eat it at, if that makes sense. And so, I think it's really important to realize that while historically, culturally, a lot of rice has been eaten, one, the grains that we're eating today, especially here in the US, I guess I don't live in India or China or Vietnam. I guess I don't know what their food system looks like as much as it does. I know, what it looks like here, but you know, the rice, the grains that we're eating here are very, very different than what has historically been eaten. Therefore, the way that our body digests it and processes it is very different. And then the way that we pair it has also changed. So, just because historically we've eaten a lot of rice in the context of the United States, um, we have to keep this in mind, right? And we're going to get into a little bit more of macros in a minute here, but one thing that I want to talk about is peasant versus elite food, because I think this is also a topic that comes up in conversation of people talking about different foods when it comes to like historical diets. And historically, the foods of the common people were beans, roots, vegetables, broths, whole grains, organ meats, and fermented foods. Um, and meat was a precious commodity. I will definitely say that these food all require skill, time, and resourcefulness to be able to obtain. And, a lot of them people now call superfoods, whether you believe that or not, when it comes to, the grains or different vegetables. I'm not here to, to argue about that, but the foods for the wealthy historically have been things like refined flour or like white flour, things like sugar, things like soft breads or pastries or more refined fats. Historically, those were the things that only like the very wealthy could afford. And these elite foods or wealthy foods um, are really actually the foods that drive obesity and diabetes and metabolic disease today, which I think is interesting because, um, yeah, I don't know. I think there's just so much doing on the internet, and people like to say, "Oh, that's peasant food," or "That's this or that." And I'm not saying that the food that they're, demonizing is like good, but I don't think it's always like giving a full picture. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, right? And we don't want to be eating a ton of white flour, sugar pastries, soft breads, things like that. So I think one of the most powerful truths in the entire history of food, as I've been looking into this and thinking about it, is that food once required time, right? It required knowledge, patience, because your food had to grow or you had to hunt it, um, and it included community to prepare, and these are the foods that support health today. And the foods that were once symbols of luxury are now the foods, truthfully, that create metabolic dysfunction. And so I think looking to, obesity, when obesity emerged, obesity increases not when carbs go up necessarily, if they're the wrong types of carbs, that can definitely be the case. And not when fat goes up, but obesity started to really rise when food became really cheap, when it became fast, when it became refined, very low in fiber, low in nutrients, and easy to overconsume, right? Disconnected from work, from time, and from culture. And obesity arises when food moves from, a whole food to something more processed to something that's ultimately ultra processed, right? And this has happened worldwide. Um, and unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves. So when we ask, what is the perfect diet? We have to remember that there has never been one perfect human diet. And anyone who says that there is, I think, is oversimplifying it. There have always been human diets shaped by living in relationship with real food. And this connects directly back to episode 28 that I did this summer, where we talked about how the perfect diet actually uh, doesn't exist. It's not a list of rules. It's more of a relationship with food, right? It's a relationship with your hunger, with your fullness, with real foods prepared in, real ways. It's with culture, with season, with your environment, with your goals, and with your internal signals. And um, so the goal isn't to eat like, one culture necessarily. I say that as someone who grew up in the Midwest, in middle America. We ate a lot of hot dish or slow cooked meals. Um, and, if you have a cultural background of food, I actually find this very interesting, how different cultures have eaten. And truthfully, I don't feel like I have a culture of like, oh, we eat this way. Like I am a mixture of German, Norwegian, Irish. And then, my husband is a mixture of different European cultures as well. And so I don't really feel like there's like one cultural way to eat. But if you do have like, if you are Chinese, if you're Vietnamese, if you're South African or, wherever you go, if you feel like you have like a culture of food, I think that's so great. And I think leaning into that and learning about that is really cool and can be like a really powerful tool on your health journey. Cause I do think there is something to be said about that genetically. But, as someone who grew up in the Midwest in America, who's very Caucasian, um, I don't feel like, for me, there's one culture or one era that I should focus on for trying to eat, right? The goal is just to return to real food in a way that supports your metabolism, that supports your nervous system, your digestion, and your life and your goals, right? And that really comes back to whole foods, to eating slow, to being intentional, to sharing in meals in community, to looking for nutrient density when we're picking out our foods, foods that are satiating, and foods that we can feel connected with, right? And this is the through line, I think, of human nourishment is it can be and it can be, I think, a through line today as we think about food. And I want to just kind of like go back to some of the things I talked about in episode 28. And if you haven't checked out that episode, I think you should. There's a lot of I think just good points to think about when you're trying to figure out how do I structure my diet so that I can meet my health goals, so that I can be healthy. And I think it always begins with realizing that the perfect diet doesn't exist. And it really comes down to, how does your body tolerate different foods, right? I think it's easy to be like, someone said this, I saw this influencer, I had this friend who did XYZ and they got these amazing results. And the reality is you aren't them, right? Like your life, the history of what you've experienced, what your body has been through is not the same. And so you might have some similar results to that person, but you really should, I think trying to just copy what someone else does takes away that connection that is so important that we kind of go back to ourselves for when it comes to figuring out what foods work for us. And if all you're doing is copying what someone else does, you miss out on this beautiful opportunity to learn more about yourself and to really tune into yourself and how your body is responding to food. And this journey always has to start with real food. I think that is the first step. Real whole foods. That's protein, those are healthy fats, lots of fruits and vegetables, maybe some grains. And then you have to figure out, how do I feel when I eat these different things? Can my body tolerate grains very well? Like I'm someone who I've just realized I just don't tolerate sugar and carbohydrates very well. Like vegetables, my body seems to really like, but a bunch of fruit, grains, potatoes, sugar. Unfortunately, I have found, they just don't agree with hope. And that is kind of a sad reality, but it is my reality. And if I want to be fit and healthy, have a clear head, feel sharp, have energy, that is the way that I need to eat, right? And I think it comes back to individuality as everything. I've worked with clients who are pretty much carnivore and they eat primarily meat and they feel so good doing that. And there's like all these health complications that they've had that become a non-issue when they eat that way. And then, I have people who really don't like eating meat for, not even like ethical reasons, but just like they just don't like it. They don't feel like they tolerate it very well. And that's okay too. And they're able to find a way to eat in a way that supports their body and gets them to their goals. Right. And so I think getting rid of this like one size fits all approach is really important, but it has to be rooted in real food. And then, also realizing our needs are going to change over time, like what our body needs. What I need now in pregnancy is going to be different than what I need when I'm in my 40s or 50s. It's different than what I needed maybe in my early 20s. Maybe I was a little less insulin resistant, right? And so I think really what it comes down to is eating real food and staying connected with how your body's responding to those foods. Because if you do that, you are giving um, your body the ability to tell you how it feels. And what I'm always so impressed with is when we tune into our body, when we give our body what it actually needs, when we're paying attention, our body is really good at telling us, what foods it likes and what foods it's not a big fan of. And so, tuning into is like, do I feel energized and mentally sharp? Do I feel satisfied when I eat? I'm not like thinking about and obsessing about food all day. Do I feel light in my body, or am I feeling inflamed or puffy? Do I feel bloated, or does my digestion feel really regular and good? And is my blood sugar and mood stable, right? These are all things that are signals to us about how our body is responding. So, in closing, this is where I want to wrap it up for today. Um, I want to encourage you to stop, taking all or nothing approaches. Stop believing um, people who make everything extremely black and white, because, really, I think, especially when it comes to nutrition, there's so much more nuance that's there. And I think it's really important to honor that. And everyone's journey is going to look a little bit different. And the foods that they feel really well eating and that their body can tolerate is going to be different. Right. And so, with that, guys, I want to say thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being curious with me and for being willing to learn, and think in a deeper way about how we nourish ourselves. And if this episode gave you something to consider, if it helped you maybe zoom out to see food with a little bit more clarity, maybe a little less pressure, I'd love it if you would take a quick second to share this episode with someone you care about. When you share my podcast, it means so much to me. And if you could leave me a review, a comment, all of that makes my day when I see them. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here to learn together, to grow together. And if you haven't already listened to episode 28, which is titled The Perfect Diet, I highly recommend going back to that one next. These two episodes are kind of like bookends. This one, maybe gives a little bit more historical, cultural story, and episode 28 brings it back home to our everyday life and our plate, and hopefully makes it really practical for you. So, as always, guys, I appreciate you for being here. Thank you for showing up for your health. And thank you for doing the work, for caring for your body, for your energy in your life. And until next time, I hope you move through your daily life with steadiness, with self-respect, and enough presence to notice the moments that really feed your life in ways that food never could. I hope you're out there finding the joy in the day-to-day, and putting a smile on your face. So with that, guys, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time on the Lifestyle School Podcast.